There are stories that refuse to fade, not because they are constantly retold, but because they seem to live somewhere beneath memory itself, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And among them, the legend of Atlantis has endured longer than most, carried from the dialogues of Plato through centuries of doubt, belief, and imagination, until it no longer feels like a simple tale, but rather like an echo of something that may once have existed just beyond the reach of certainty. It begins, as such stories often do, not with a city or a people, but with a place, an island said to lie beyond the pillars of Heracles, where the known world gave way to a vast and open sea, and where the air itself seemed different, touched by salt and distance, and the quiet suggestion that what lay ahead did not belong to ordinary geography, but to something more deliberate, more hidden, as if the world had chosen to keep this land apart. At the center of that island rose a modest hill of red earth and living stone, not grand enough to command awe, yet steady enough to invite it. And upon that hill lived a young woman named Cleito, the last of her family, whose life passed in a silence that was not empty, but full of the small, steady rhythms of a place untouched by ambition, where each day resembled the one before it, and yet never felt wasted. When Poseidon came upon her, it was not with the violence that men later associated with the sea, but with a presence that felt inevitable, as though he had always been meant to stand upon that hill and see what it held. And in that quiet meeting between God and mortal, something shifted, not only in the life of Cleito, but in the fate of the land itself. Poseidon did not simply claim the place, nor did he leave it unchanged, but instead began to shape it with a kind of careful precision that suggested intention rather than impulse, carving the land into a series of perfect circles that spread outward from the hill, cutting deep channels and filling them with seawater, so that the island became a pattern of alternating rings of land and water, as though the very surface of the earth had been arranged to reflect a design that only a god could fully understand. From above, the island would have appeared like ripples frozen in time, each ring holding its place with unnatural perfection, forming not only a barrier, but a statement. A quiet declaration that this was a place set apart, protected not by walls alone, but by distance, symmetry, and the will that had created it, ensuring that no one could reach the center without passing through layers of intention. Within the innermost ring, Poseidon established a home for Cleito, surrounding it with a grove where the air remained cool and the wind moved gently through the leaves, carrying with it a sense of presence that never quite faded. And from the bedrock he brought forth 2 springs, one warm and one cold, so that the land itself seemed to breathe in balance, offering both comfort and clarity to those who lived upon it. In time, people would say that these waters carried something more than simple nourishment, that bread made from grain grown nearby tasted richer, and that wine aged longer without losing its strength. But whether such claims were truth or memory shaped by affection hardly mattered, because what endured was the belief that the island itself was alive with a quiet generosity. From the union of God and mortal came 10 sons, born in pairs and raised not as rivals, but as parts of a single order, with Atlas, the eldest, standing apart not through force, but through presence, his voice carrying a weight that the others instinctively recognized. And to him Poseidon gave dominion over the island, not as a privilege alone, but as a responsibility that would bind all the brothers together under a shared structure. The ocean that surrounded the island would one day take his name, becoming the Atlantic, a reminder carried not in monuments but in language. And to his brothers were given lands of their own, each tasked with governance and loyalty, forming a system that was as much about unity as it was about rule, where authority flowed from the center outward, but always returned again. In those early years, there was no rush toward grandeur, no hunger for conquest, and no desire to transform the land beyond what was necessary, as the sons of Poseidon lived with a restraint that seemed almost instinctive, building first in wood and only later in stone, settling near the central hill and preserving the rings as both boundary and memory of the divine act that had shaped them. They established a sacred precinct at the center, not yet adorned with gold or elaborate carvings, but marked by intention, where offerings were made in simple forms, carved beams, polished stones, and early works of metal drawn from the earth, including a strange red substance that gleamed like a hidden fire and would one day be known as orichalcum, valued for its beauty and its resistance to time. The land responded with abundance, yielding grain, fruit, timber, and game in quantities that seemed almost effortless. Yet the people did not take this as permission to abandon discipline, but instead treated it as something to be maintained, something that required care and balance, and so their lives settled into rhythms of work, worship, and quiet governance. Visitors arrived slowly, drawn by rumor or chance, and were received with caution, offered food and water but not immediate access to the heart of the island. Because even then, the people understood that what is easily given away is easily lost, and that the center must remain protected if the whole was to endure. Storms came, as they always do, rising from the sea with a force that reminded them of the power that had created their home. Yet each time the winds passed and the waters calmed, the island remained, its rings unbroken, its springs still flowing, and its people returned to the precinct in quiet gratitude, aware that survival itself was never something to assume. So the beginnings of Atlantis were not marked by spectacle or excess, but by care, by structure, and by a kind of humility that would, in time, be forgotten, as a god shaped a sanctuary, a woman lived at its heart, and 10 sons learned, for a brief and fragile moment, to value what they had been given more than what they might one day become. The sons of Poseidon did not inherit a kingdom in the way men later came to understand such things, for there was no throne waiting to be claimed, no court already shaped by ambition, and no rivals whispering at the edges of power. But rather a land still quiet with possibility, where authority had to be learned as carefully as the paths between the rings, and where the weight of rule came not from conquest, but from the responsibility of preserving something that had been given whole. Atlas, as the eldest, stood at the center of this inheritance, not elevated by spectacle or ceremony, but by the simple and undeniable recognition of his brothers, who saw in him a steadiness that did not need to be declared. And when he spoke, it was not with the urgency of command, but with the calm certainty of someone who understood that decisions, once made, would shape not only the present, but the generations that followed. To each of the 9 brothers, portions of the island were given, not as separate kingdoms to be divided and contested, but as regions to be governed in harmony, their boundaries defined not by walls or conflict, but by natural lines of river, hill, and forest. And though each ruled his own land, all were bound to the center, required to return, to report, and to remember that their authority was part of something larger than themselves. This structure, simple as it appeared, carried within it a quiet strength, for it allowed the island to grow without fracturing, to expand without losing its sense of unity. And in those early years, the brothers honored this balance with a discipline that seemed almost effortless, as though the memory of their father's design still guided them in ways they did not fully question. The land itself encouraged such harmony, for it gave freely, and in doing so it removed the urgency that so often drives men toward greed. As fields yielded grain in soft abundance, vineyards thickened under careful hands, and orchards offered fruit in quantities that required not struggle, but organization. teaching the people that prosperity, when shared, becomes stability rather than excess. Villages formed gradually across the outer rings and beyond, not crowded or chaotic, but spaced with intention, each one connected by paths and waterways that followed the natural design of the island, so that movement itself became a reflection of order, and a man traveling from field to harbor could feel, even without thinking, that he was part of something measured and deliberate. Atlas and his brothers met often at the central hill, not to display authority, but to maintain it, gathering in the precinct where their father had first set his mark, and there, in the presence of the springs and the quiet grove, they spoke of harvests, of roads, of disputes that needed settling, and of decisions that would shape the seasons to come, learning slowly that rule was not a moment, but a continuous act of attention. It was during these gatherings that the first laws began to take form, not written at first, but remembered, spoken, and repeated until they became part of the rhythm of life. Laws that emphasized balance over punishment, responsibility over privilege, and unity over pride, ensuring that no brother, no matter how distant his land, could forget the center from which his authority flowed. The people followed this example, not because they were forced to, but because it worked. As disputes between neighbors were settled with fairness, fields were shared when needed, and resources were distributed with an understanding that the strength of one region depended upon the stability of all, creating a society where cooperation was not idealized, but practiced daily. Trade began quietly, almost as an extension of curiosity rather than ambition, as small boats crossed the outer waters, carrying goods that were not necessary, but desired. Amber from distant shores, fine cloth, tools shaped in unfamiliar ways. And in return, Atlantis offered what it had in abundance: grain, timber, crafted goods, and a harbor that provided shelter unlike any other. Yet even as the island opened itself in these small ways, it remained careful. For entry to the central rings was controlled, and visitors were received with courtesy, but not with access, as guards stationed at the crossings ensured that the heart of Atlantis remained protected, reinforcing the idea that not everything valuable should be made easily available. In time, the sacred precinct itself grew in importance, not in size or decoration, but in meaning, as it became the place where not only offerings were made, but where unity was reaffirmed, where the brothers reminded themselves of their shared origin, and where the people gathered during harvests and festivals to give thanks for what the land continued to provide. It was here that the strange red metal, later called orichalcum, began to take on greater significance, no longer simply a curiosity drawn from the earth, but a material associated with the sacred, used sparingly in objects that marked importance, its glow in firelight becoming a symbol of the island's hidden wealth and quiet power. Despite this growing prosperity, the sons of Poseidon did not rush to display their fortune, for they understood, whether by instinct or teaching, that wealth, when made too visible, invites desire, and desire, when unchecked, leads to imbalance. And so they chose restraint, allowing their civilization to deepen before it expanded. Seasons passed, and with them came the steady growth of knowledge, as farmers learned to shape the land more efficiently. Engineers began to refine the waterways, and craftsmen improved their techniques, each small advancement building upon the last, not in leaps, but in careful, deliberate steps that ensured stability was never sacrificed for speed. The sea remained both ally and reminder, bringing trade and opportunity, but also storms that tested the island's resilience. And each time the waters rose and the winds struck the outer shores, the people were reminded that their prosperity existed within a larger world that could not be controlled, only respected. In those moments, when the storms passed and the sky cleared, the brothers would return again to the central hill, standing together near the springs, listening to the water as it continued to flow unchanged. And in that quiet continuity, they found reassurance, a sense that, as long as they remembered their purpose, the island would endure. Thus, Atlantis, in its early generations, was not defined by greatness in the way later ages would describe it, but by balance, by a system that worked because it was maintained, and by leaders who understood, at least for a time, that power is safest when it is shared, and strongest when it is restrained. Time, which so often erodes what men build in haste, seemed instead to strengthen what had been laid with care upon the island. And as the generations born after Atlas and his brothers came of age, they inherited not only land and name, but a system so deeply woven into daily life that it no longer felt like something imposed, but something as natural as the turning of seasons. And in this quiet continuity, Atlantis began to transform from a settlement of order into a civilization of intention. The fields beyond the rings became the foundation of this growth, stretching outward in long, measured expanses where the soil shifted from dark richness near the waterways to lighter earth beneath groves of pine. Yet both yielded generously under the hands of those who understood how to work with the land rather than against it. And, over time, patterns emerged, not only of planting and harvest, but of timing, of knowing when to water, when to rest the soil, and when to trust that the earth would give without being pressed too hard. Water, more than any other element, shaped the rhythm of life. As the early channels cut by the sons of Poseidon were refined into a network of irrigation that carried the lifeblood of the island across fields and into settlements, allowing crops to grow even in seasons when rain was scarce, and teaching the people that mastery did not come from domination, but from understanding the quiet language of flow and balance. Families worked these lands not in isolation, but in small communities where labor was shared and knowledge passed from one generation to the next, as fathers showed sons how to read the slope of the ground, and mothers taught daughters how to preserve what was gathered, ensuring that abundance was not wasted and that each harvest strengthened the one that would follow. Beyond the fields, forests provided timber that was cut with restraint, guided by early rules that required renewal for every tree taken. And though such measures may have seemed unnecessary in a land so rich, they reflected a mindset that had begun to define Atlantis, a belief that even abundance must be protected if it is to endure. Stone, too, became part of this transformation, as quarries revealed layers of white, red, and black rock that could be shaped into structures more lasting than wood. And though the earliest buildings had been simple, the growing skill of the masons allowed for the creation of homes, storehouses, and public spaces that combined strength with a quiet beauty, their colors arranged in patterns that reflected both function and design. The rings themselves, once purely defensive, began to take on new roles, as bridges were constructed across the narrower channels, allowing movement between sections of land without disrupting the natural barriers. And canals were deepened and extended, connecting the outer waters to the open sea so that ships could enter safely and goods could move efficiently from shore to center. Trade expanded as a result, not through sudden ambition, but through steady reputation, as sailors who had once arrived cautiously now returned with purpose, drawn by the reliability of the harbor and the fairness of exchange. And in the markets that formed along the outer rings, one could find goods from distant lands laid beside those of Atlantis, creating a quiet convergence of cultures that enriched the island without overwhelming it. Yet even as these exchanges grew, the heart of Atlantis remained unchanged. For access to the inner rings was still controlled, and the sacred precinct continued to serve as both spiritual and civic center, where decisions were made, disputes resolved, and traditions maintained, ensuring that expansion did not lead to dilution of identity. Education became an essential part of this stability, as children were taught not only practical skills, but also the principles that underpinned their society, learning to read, to count, and to draw the maps that defined their world, so that even the youngest understood the structure of the island and their place within it. And in this way, knowledge became a shared foundation rather than a guarded privilege. Craftsmanship flourished alongside agriculture and trade, as artisans refined their work in pottery, weaving, metalwork, and carving, producing objects that were both functional and beautiful. And among these, the use of the red metal, orichalcum, became more refined, appearing in small but meaningful details that signaled both skill and status, without overwhelming the simplicity that still defined much of life. Markets grew more organized, with designated areas for different trades, ensuring that commerce flowed as smoothly as water through the canals, and the presence of scribes and record-keepers introduced a new layer of structure, as transactions were noted, agreements recorded, and the movement of goods tracked, creating a system that allowed the island to grow without losing clarity. Festivals began to mark the passage of time, not as extravagant displays, but as communal acknowledgments of cycles, with celebrations tied to harvests, to the springs, and to the laws that governed them, reinforcing the idea that prosperity was not an individual achievement, but a shared condition maintained through cooperation and respect. The military, though not yet central to identity, was never neglected, as training grounds were established and men learned to move in formation, to handle weapons, and to respond to signals, not out of a desire for conquest, but from an understanding that peace is most secure when it is protected by readiness. And this quiet discipline became another thread in the fabric of Atlantean life. Through all of this, the influence of Atlas remained present, not always directly, but through the systems he had established, and through the continued gatherings of rulers at the central hill, where each generation reaffirmed the balance between authority and responsibility, ensuring that no single region grew too distant from the whole. Visitors who reached the island during this time often spoke not of its wealth, though that was evident, but of its order, of the way each part seemed to fit with the others, as if the entire civilization had been designed with the same care as the rings themselves. And for many, this sense of harmony was more impressive than any display of gold or power. And yet, beneath this balance, something subtle had begun to change, not visible in structures or systems, but in perception, as those who had been born into prosperity began to see it not as something maintained, but as something given. And though this shift was slight, almost imperceptible, it carried within it the first hint that the harmony of Atlantis, however strong it appeared, was not beyond the reach of time. Atlas did not so much ascend to kingship as grow into it, the way a tree settles into the space it was always meant to fill. And by the time the island had reached its first true maturity, his presence at the center of Atlantis felt less like authority imposed, and more like gravity itself. Something unseen yet unmistakable, holding together the many parts that might otherwise have drifted apart if left to their own quiet ambitions. Under his guidance, what had once been custom began to take the form of law, not hastily written or rigidly enforced, but shaped over time through practice, memory, and agreement, until, at last, those laws were inscribed upon a pillar of orichalcum within the sacred precinct, their words reflecting not only rules, but a philosophy of balance, duty, and restraint that defined what it meant to belong to Atlantis. It was decreed that the 10 rulers, descendants of Poseidon, would gather at fixed intervals every 5th and 6th year to judge matters that could not be settled within a single region. And there, before the pillar and the temple, they would renew their oath, binding themselves not only to the law, but to one another, ensuring that power remained shared, even as the island continued to grow in complexity. The ceremony itself was both solemn and visceral, for it required the hunting of a bull within the precinct, not one raised in comfort, but one strong enough to resist, so that the act carried meaning beyond ritual, reminding each ruler that authority was not inherited without effort, and that strength, whether of body or will, must be proven if it was to be trusted. Around them, the city that had once been modest began to take on a more defined and enduring form, as stone replaced wood in increasing measure, and the three great rings of land were fortified with walls that reflected both the resources of the island and the skill of its builders. The outer wall clad in bronze, the middle in pale tin, and the inner in the red glow of orichalcum, so that the city itself became a reflection of the materials drawn from its depths. Bridges spanned the waters between the rings with a precision that spoke of both engineering and intention, allowing carts, animals, and people to move efficiently from one section to another, while drawbridges closer to the center could be raised when needed, preserving the defensive strength that had been part of the island's design since its beginning. A great canal was cut from the outermost ring to the open sea, straight and deep, marked by stone, so that even in poor visibility, a skilled pilot could guide a vessel inward. And once inside, ships found calm waters where they could anchor safely, protected from the storms that often troubled the open ocean, turning Atlantis into a harbor that sailors spoke of with admiration and relief. Within the innermost ring, the temple rose, not as a monument to excess, but as a carefully measured structure that balanced grandeur with restraint. Its columns adorned with plates of red metal, its roof catching the first light of morning. And within, a statue of Poseidon stood, depicted with trident in hand and chariot behind him, as though he still moved through the waters that surrounded the island. Beside him stood Plato, not forgotten, but honored, her presence a reminder that Atlantis had not been born of power alone, but of union, of something both divine and human. And this duality shaped the identity of the people who gathered there, seeing in the temple not only a place of worship, but a reflection of their own origin. The city beyond the temple grew with equal care, its streets laid out to follow the natural curves of the rings, its markets positioned for both accessibility and order, and its districts organized so that each trade had its place. Smiths in one quarter, potters in another, merchants near the waterways, and schools on higher ground where the air remained clear and cool. Water, carried from the springs and through carefully maintained channels, flowed into fountains, baths, and homes, providing not only sustenance, but comfort, and the management of this system became a discipline in itself, with stewards responsible for its upkeep, ensuring that no part of the city was left without access to what it needed. The plains beyond the city were mapped and divided with a precision that reflected the growing sophistication of Atlantean thought. Canals running in straight lines across the land, fields arranged in measured plots, and roads built to remain passable even in poor weather, allowing goods to move efficiently from farm to harbor and back again. Forests were managed with strict rules, requiring that new growth replace what had been taken, and though such policies demanded patience, they ensured that the island's resources remained stable, reinforcing the idea that prosperity was not a moment, but a condition maintained through discipline and foresight. Trade expanded further, bringing goods from distant regions and carrying Atlantean craftsmanship outward. And with it came new ideas, new techniques, and a broader awareness of the world beyond the island. Yet, this expansion was still controlled, guided by laws that prioritized balance over gain, preventing the kind of unchecked growth that might have disrupted the harmony within. Daily life reflected this structure, as markets operated with efficiency, courts handled disputes with consistency, and festivals marked the passing of time with rituals that reinforced shared identity, from the blending of waters from the two springs to the celebration of ships and the recitation of laws, each act serving as a reminder of the principles upon which the city stood. Even the military, though not dominant, was integrated into this order, with training grounds established and equipment maintained, ensuring readiness without glorifying conflict, as Atlantis understood that strength was most effective when it did not need to be used. To those who visited, the city appeared not merely wealthy, but complete, as though every part had been considered and placed with purpose, creating a sense of stability that inspired both admiration and a quiet envy, for it suggested that Atlantis had achieved something rare, a balance between growth and control, between power and restraint. And yet, in this very perfection, there lay the first shadow of what was to come. For a system so finely tuned leaves little room for error, and those who grow within it may begin to mistake its stability for permanence, forgetting that even the strongest structures depend upon the continued willingness of those within them to uphold what they have inherited. A city can often be understood not by its monuments or its rulers, but by the quiet patterns of its ordinary days. And in Atlantis, those days unfolded with a steadiness that gave the illusion of permanence, as though the rhythms of work, trade, learning, and rest had settled into a form so balanced that it might continue unchanged for generations yet to come, untouched by the uncertainties that troubled other lands. At dawn, the harbor stirred first, long before the sun fully cleared the outer wall, as dock workers moved along the piers with practiced efficiency, sweeping, counting, recording, their movements guided not by urgency but by habit refined over years. While scribes sat with tablets and styluses, marking the arrival of ships, the names of captains, and the nature of their cargo, creating a record that transformed motion into order. Fishermen returned with the early light, their boats low in the water, bringing in catches that would soon fill the market stalls, and the air carried the clean scent of the sea rather than decay, for the systems in place ensured that nothing lingered longer than it should, and even waste was managed with a care that reflected the broader discipline of the city. The markets themselves awakened gradually, not with chaos, but with a measured unfolding, as vendors arranged their goods in neat displays, grain in sacks, fish on slanted tables, pottery stacked with care, and metalwork laid out to catch the light, while buyers moved among them with an understanding of value that came from familiarity rather than haggling, trusting that fairness had already been built into the system. Nearby, the forges came alive, as smiths coaxed flame from charcoal and shaped metal with steady hands, their work producing tools, fittings, and ornaments that combined function with subtle beauty. And among these, the presence of orichalcum, the red metal drawn from the island's depths, added a quiet distinction, appearing not in excess, but in details that suggested both skill and restraint. Beyond the markets, the streets carried a different rhythm, as carts moved along designated paths, bringing goods from the outer rings and the plains beyond, their routes planned so that traffic flowed without obstruction, while pedestrians followed walkways that curved with the design of the city, creating a sense of movement that felt natural rather than forced. Education held a central place within this structure, with schools situated where air and light could support long hours of learning. And there, children of all backgrounds were taught not only letters and numbers, but also the principles that governed their society, learning to draw the rings of the island, to understand the flow of water, and to recognize the balance that sustained their world. The courts operated with similar clarity, housed in long halls where disputes were heard and resolved with a consistency that reinforced trust, as judges appointed by the rulers carried out their duties with an awareness that their authority came not from personal power, but from the laws inscribed upon the pillar at the center, ensuring that justice remained aligned with principle rather than preference. Punishments, when necessary, were measured, often taking the form of fines or labor rather than cruelty, reflecting a belief that correction was more valuable than retribution. And in this way, even those who erred were given the opportunity to return to the order from which they had strayed. Homes throughout the city reflected the same balance, built around small courtyards that provided light and air, with spaces arranged for both work and rest, where families lived across generations, sharing responsibilities and preserving traditions. And within each household, small altars reminded them of the divine presence that had shaped their world. Meals were simple yet nourishing, consisting of bread, fish, olives, and occasionally meat, prepared with an understanding that flavor did not require excess, and that the value of food lay not only in its taste, but in the care with which it was produced and shared. Festivals punctuated the year, offering moments of collective expression that reinforced unity. From the Day of the Springs, when warm and cold waters were mixed in symbolic balance, to the Day of Ships, when sailors and citizens alike celebrated the connection between land and sea, and to the Day of Laws, when the pillar was cleaned and the words inscribed upon it were read aloud, reminding all who listened of the principles that guided them. The military, though present, did not dominate daily life, but its influence could be seen in the discipline of the people as training grounds hosted regular drills and equipment was maintained with care, ensuring that readiness remained a constant, even in times of peace, reflecting the understanding that stability must be protected if it is to endure. Foreign visitors found both welcome and structure, as guest houses provided accommodation and interpreters facilitated communication, while customs ensured that trade remained fair and predictable, creating a reputation that drew merchants back, not only for profit, but for the reliability that Atlantis offered. Yet within this order, subtle changes began to emerge, not in the systems themselves, but in how they were perceived, as those who had grown up within this stability began to take it for granted, seeing the smooth functioning of the city not as the result of effort, but as a natural state. And in this quiet shift of perspective, the first seeds of imbalance were planted. Small indulgences appeared, a slightly richer garment, a more elaborate ornament, a decision made with convenience rather than principle. And though each seemed insignificant on its own, together they hinted at a gradual movement away from the restraint that had once defined Atlantis. The city continued to function, its markets full, its laws enforced, its festivals celebrated. And to any observer, it remained a place of remarkable harmony. Yet beneath that surface, something had begun to loosen. Not enough to cause immediate concern, but enough to suggest that the balance so carefully maintained might not be as unshakable as it appeared. There comes a moment in the life of every great civilization when its strength no longer needs to be proven, when its systems function so smoothly and its prosperity flows so steadily that those who live within it begin to feel as though such stability is not the result of effort, but the natural order of the world. And in Atlantis, that moment arrived quietly, without declaration, settling over the island like a calm sea that reflects the sky so perfectly, one forgets how deep the water truly is. The ringed city, shaped over generations with care and intention, now stood in full expression of its design, its canals carrying ships with ease, its bridges linking land with precision, and its walls gleaming in layers of metal that caught the light differently at each hour of the day, so that a traveler approaching from the sea might believe he was witnessing not a city built by human hands, but something closer to a vision made solid. Within those walls, life moved with a confidence that bordered on certainty, as markets overflowed with goods not only from the island itself, but from distant shores that had come to rely upon Atlantis as both partner and protector, and warehouses filled with grain, timber, metal, and crafted objects stood as quiet evidence of a system that had learned how to produce, store, and distribute without waste. The temple at the center, dedicated to Poseidon and Plato, shone with a measured brilliance, its surfaces reflecting both sunlight and firelight in a way that suggested reverence rather than excess. And those who entered its halls often spoke of a feeling that was difficult to describe, a sense that they stood not only in a place of worship, but within the very idea that had given the island its form. The laws inscribed upon the pillar remained unchanged, their words still recited during festivals and assemblies, yet their presence had begun to shift from something actively remembered to something quietly assumed, as fewer people felt the need to reflect upon their meaning, when daily life seemed to confirm that all was already as it should be. Education flourished, producing generations who could read, calculate, navigate, and build with a level of skill that impressed even the most experienced visitors. And yet, for many, this knowledge was no longer accompanied by the same sense of humility that had once guided their ancestors, but instead by a growing confidence that bordered on pride. Craftsmanship reached new heights as artisans refined their techniques to produce works of remarkable detail and beauty, from finely woven textiles to intricately carved stone and metal objects that incorporated orichalcum in ways that highlighted its unique glow. And these creations began to circulate not only within Atlantis, but far beyond it, spreading the island's reputation across the known world. Trade networks expanded accordingly, reaching deeper into foreign lands and establishing relationships that were both economic and cultural, as Atlantean goods became symbols of quality and reliability, and in return, the island received materials and ideas that further enriched its already advanced society. The military, once a quiet presence, grew more visible, not out of necessity, but as a reflection of the island's expanding influence. With ships constructed to higher standards, their hulls reinforced, their crews trained with increasing precision, and their appearance enhanced with decorative elements that signaled both strength and prestige. On land, training grounds echoed with the sounds of drills as soldiers practiced formations and maneuvers that allowed them to move as a unified force. And though conflict remained distant, the readiness of Atlantis became a source of reassurance, reinforcing the belief that the island could not easily be threatened. Festivals grew more elaborate, not abandoning their original meanings but expanding in scale, with larger gatherings, more abundant offerings, and performances that celebrated not only the gods and the laws, but the achievements of the people themselves, creating moments where pride and gratitude began to blend in ways that were not always easy to distinguish. In private life, comfort increased, as homes became more refined, adorned with decorative elements that reflected both personal taste and social standing. And while such changes did not immediately disrupt the balance of society, they introduced a subtle shift in values, where appearance began to carry slightly more weight than function. The rulers, descendants of Poseidon, continued to meet and govern, their authority still recognized and their duties still performed. Yet even among them, the sense of responsibility that had once defined their role began to share space with a growing awareness of their own status. And decisions, while still guided by law, were occasionally influenced by considerations that would once have been set aside. Visitors arriving during this period often spoke of Atlantis with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, describing a place where order and abundance seemed to coexist without conflict, where systems functioned with a precision that made them appear effortless, and where the people themselves carried an air of quiet confidence that set them apart from others. Yet beneath this surface of perfection, something subtle had begun to change. Not in the structures or the systems, but in the mindset of those who lived within them, as the memory of effort faded and was replaced by expectation. And the understanding that balance required maintenance gave way, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to the belief that it would endure on its own. It was not a dramatic shift, nor one that could be easily pointed to or named, but rather a gradual movement, like the turning of a tide that goes unnoticed until the shoreline has already begun to change. And in Atlantis, this unseen turning marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the very success of the civilization would begin to reshape it in ways its founders had never intended. Decline, when it comes to a civilization that has known long stability, rarely announces itself with ruin or fire, but instead arrives in smaller, quieter forms, changes so slight that they pass unnoticed at first. And in Atlantis, the shift began not with broken laws or empty markets, but with a subtle alteration in how people thought about the things they already possessed, as abundance, once treated with care, slowly came to be seen as something expected rather than maintained. The city still gleamed, as it always had, its walls catching the light in bronze, tin, and the deep red glow of orichalcum, its canals filled with ships, its markets crowded with goods. Yet those who walked its streets each day no longer saw these things as achievements to be preserved, but as features of a world that seemed permanent. And in that quiet assumption, the first layer of vigilance began to fade. Merchants who had once taken pride in fair exchange began, in small ways, to test the limits of that fairness, adding slight weight to a measure, adjusting a price with the confidence that no one would notice. And though such acts were minor, they marked a shift from shared trust to individual gain, a shift that spread slowly, like a ripple that does not disturb the surface, but changes the current beneath. Within the courts, where justice had long been administered with clarity and consistency, delays began to appear, not through negligence, but through preference, as cases involving influential families were postponed or softened, and judges, still bound by law, found ways to interpret those laws with a flexibility that had once been unnecessary, allowing status to influence outcomes in ways that were difficult to name, but easy to feel. Among the ruling class, descendants of Poseidon, the sense of duty that had defined earlier generations began to share space with a growing awareness of privilege, as gatherings at the central hill, once focused entirely on governance, gradually took on elements of display, with garments becoming richer, adornments more visible, and conversations occasionally drifting from necessity toward admiration. Festivals, too, began to change, expanding not only in size but in tone, as celebrations that had once reinforced balance and gratitude now carried a stronger note of pride, with performances that praised rulers by name and offerings that emphasized abundance rather than restraint, creating moments where the original meaning of the rituals was not lost, but softened. The temple remained at the heart of the city, its presence unchanged, its statue of Poseidon still commanding quiet reverence. Yet, even here, the atmosphere shifted slightly, as visitors came not only to honor the divine, but also to witness the beauty of the structure itself, and, in doing so, began to see it as a symbol of Atlantean greatness, as much as a place of worship. Wealth, which had once circulated steadily through trade and shared systems, began to gather in certain hands as families with greater resources acquired more land, more goods, and more influence, creating subtle divisions within a society that had once prided itself on balance. And though these divisions were not yet severe, they introduced a new dynamic, one in which equality of opportunity was no longer assumed. Loans and contracts became more common, allowing those with wealth to extend their reach further, and those without to depend upon them in ways that gradually shifted the structure of society, creating relationships that were no longer based solely on cooperation, but increasingly on obligation. And with obligation came tension, even if it remained unspoken. The military, reflecting the broader changes within the city, grew more ornate, as ships were fitted not only for strength, but for appearance, their rams plated with shining metal, their prows carved with elaborate designs, and while their effectiveness remained, The emphasis on display introduced a subtle difference between readiness and impression. Training continued, but in some cases it became performance, as drills were extended to impress visiting dignitaries, and precision was showcased as much for admiration as for necessity, creating moments where the line between preparation and exhibition began to blur. Even in daily life, small signs appeared: a preference for finer clothing over durability, a taste for imported goods over local ones, a growing interest in distinction rather than function. And though each choice seemed harmless, together they indicated a gradual movement away from the principles that had once guided the island. There were those who noticed these changes, elders who remembered earlier years, priests who sensed a shift in the tone of devotion, craftsmen who saw the difference between necessity and excess. Yet their concerns were often dismissed, not out of malice, but because the city still functioned, its systems still held, and its prosperity remained visible. The laws inscribed upon the pillar had not changed, but the way they were lived had begun to bend, and this distinction, though subtle, was critical, for it marked the point at which a society moves from being guided by principle to being guided by interpretation. And once that shift begins, it rarely stops on its own. Yet to an outsider, Atlantis would still have appeared flawless, a place of unmatched order and wealth, where the streets were clean, the markets full, and the people confident. And perhaps that was what made the change so difficult to recognize. For nothing had yet broken, nothing had yet failed, and so there seemed no reason to believe that anything ever would. But decline does not require collapse to begin. Only the quiet erosion of the values that once held everything in place. And in Atlantis, that erosion had already started, slow and almost invisible, like the turning of a tide beneath a surface that still reflects the sky. Power rarely announces the moment it changes its nature. And in Atlantis, the transformation did not come through a single decision or a sudden upheaval, but through a gradual shift in how authority was exercised, as those who governed the island began, almost without realizing it, to see their role not only as stewards of balance, but as holders of privilege. And once that distinction took root, it began to influence choices in ways that would have once seemed unthinkable. The rulers, still gathered beneath the gaze of Poseidon and the enduring presence of Plato, continued their councils. But the tone of those meetings had altered, no longer defined solely by duty, but increasingly shaped by ambition, as discussions turned toward expansion, influence, and the advantages that might be gained beyond the boundaries of the island itself. Where once disputes had been resolved with careful attention to fairness, now there were instances where outcomes reflected alliances rather than principles, as powerful families found ways to protect their interests, and decisions that should have been impartial carried the subtle weight of expectation, creating a system that still resembled justice, but no longer embodied it fully. The pillar of law remained unchanged, its inscriptions as clear as ever. Yet its authority had begun to weaken, not because it was ignored, but because it was interpreted, bent just enough to accommodate convenience. And in that flexibility, the certainty that had once defined Atlantean society began to erode. Economic structures shifted alongside governance, as wealth, once circulating freely, became increasingly concentrated, with certain households controlling resources on a scale that allowed them to influence not only trade, but policy. And as lending practices expanded, debts began to bind individuals and communities in ways that altered the balance of independence that had once characterized the island. Farmers who had once relied on shared systems now found themselves obligated to repay loans across seasons. Merchants adjusted their practices to compete with larger operations, and the quiet equality that had defined earlier generations gave way to a more stratified society, where opportunity was no longer evenly distributed. The temple, still standing at the heart of the city, continued to host rituals and ceremonies. Yet even here, the focus had shifted slightly, as offerings grew more elaborate, not always from devotion, but from a desire to be seen. And priests, though still committed to their roles, found themselves navigating a space where reverence and display were no longer clearly separated. Festivals reflected this change as well, expanding in scale and spectacle, with performances that celebrated not only the gods and the laws, but the achievements of individuals, particularly those in positions of power, reinforcing a culture where recognition began to carry as much weight as responsibility. The military, once a quiet assurance of stability, grew in both size and prominence, as ships were built not only for defense, but with an eye toward projection, their designs emphasizing presence as much as function, and training shifted from preparation for necessity to readiness for possibility, as the idea of expansion took hold. Naval commanders began to speak of routes beyond the familiar, of territories that could be secured, of influence that could be extended. And these ideas, once distant, gained traction within the councils, supported by those who saw in them an opportunity to elevate Atlantis from a model of balance to a force of dominance. On land, infrastructure expanded with a new urgency. Roads extended more rapidly, outposts established in areas that had previously been left untouched, and resources allocated not only to maintenance but to growth, creating a sense that the island was no longer content to exist within its boundaries, but sought to define those boundaries anew. Diplomacy, too, began to change, as relationships with other regions shifted from mutual exchange to subtle control, with agreements that favored Atlantis more heavily, and the presence of its ships and envoys carried an implicit expectation of compliance, altering the nature of interaction from partnership to influence. For many within the island, these changes were not immediately troubling, but rather a source of pride, as they signaled strength and capability, reinforcing the belief that Atlantis had outgrown its earlier limitations and was destined for a greater role in the world beyond. Yet there were those who saw the danger in this transformation, who understood that the balance which had sustained the island was being replaced by a different kind of structure, one that relied not on restraint, but on expansion. And they recognized that such a shift, once begun, would be difficult to reverse. The memory of earlier generations, of simplicity, of shared responsibility, of laws followed without question began to fade, replaced by a new narrative in which success justified change, and in which the achievements of the present overshadowed the lessons of the past. Atlantis still stood strong, its systems functioning, its wealth intact, its people confident. Yet beneath that strength, the foundation had begun to shift, not enough to cause immediate collapse, but enough to alter the direction of its future, setting the stage for a transformation that would carry it far from the balance upon which it had been built. And as the island turned its attention outward, looking beyond its rings toward lands that had once seemed distant and irrelevant, it did so with a certainty that bordered on inevitability, unaware that in seeking to expand its influence, it was also moving closer to the moment when its own limits would finally be tested. The turning outward did not happen in a single proclamation, nor was there a moment when the people of Atlantis gathered and declared themselves an empire, but rather it emerged through decisions that seemed, at first, entirely reasonable, each one building upon the last, until the island, once defined by its inward balance, found itself extending its reach across the sea with a confidence that no longer questioned its own purpose. It began with maps, drawn in the council chambers where rulers and advisors gathered, not merely to record what was known, but to imagine what might be claimed, as coastlines once noted for trade were now marked with symbols indicating resources, populations, and strategic value, transforming geography into opportunity in a way that subtly altered how the world beyond Atlantis was perceived. Reports arrived from merchants, sailors, and envoys describing distant harbors, fertile lands, and rival powers. And these accounts, once treated as curiosities, were now studied with intent, their details feeding into discussions that considered not only exchange, but influence, protection, and control, as the language of cooperation gradually took on a sharper edge. Within the councils, descendants of Poseidon debated the path forward, some urging caution, reminding their peers that the laws had been designed to preserve the island, not to extend it, while others argued that strength unused was strength wasted, and that the prosperity of Atlantis could serve as a model, even a force, for order beyond its shores. In the end, it was not a single argument that prevailed, but a growing consensus that expansion could be justified if it brought stability, if it protected trade routes, if it reduced conflict in regions where disorder threatened the flow of goods and influence. And with this reasoning, the first steps were taken not as conquest, but as intervention. Ships were prepared with greater purpose, their construction refined, their crews trained not only for navigation, but for coordinated action, as formations were practiced and signals standardized, allowing fleets to move with a precision that reflected years of quiet preparation now brought into focus. Outposts were established along key routes, initially as places of support for traders, offering fresh water, supplies, and repair. But these locations soon took on additional roles, housing small garrisons that ensured security and reinforced the presence of Atlantis in regions that had previously existed beyond its direct influence. Diplomatic missions followed, presenting agreements that offered protection and partnership, yet carried within them expectations that gradually shifted the balance of power as local leaders found themselves aligning more closely with Atlantean interests, sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity. In coastal towns, the arrival of Atlantean ships became a sign of both opportunity and pressure, as markets adapted to new demands and local economies began to reflect the influence of a distant, yet increasingly present authority. One that did not always impose itself openly, but was, nevertheless, felt. Trade routes expanded further, connecting regions that had once operated independently. And while this brought prosperity, it also created dependence, as communities began to rely on the stability that Atlantis provided, reinforcing the island's role as a central force within a growing network. Military readiness, once a precaution, became a defining feature as fleets were organized into structured units, commanders given clear hierarchies, and training intensified to ensure that the projection of power could be sustained across distances, marking a shift from defense to capability. On land, similar changes occurred as infrastructure extended outward, roads improved, supply lines established, and the capacity to support operations beyond the island increased, reflecting a level of planning that suggested not temporary action, but long-term presence. To many within Atlantis, these developments were seen as natural progress, a continuation of the island's growth, and a demonstration of its ability to bring order to a wider world, reinforcing a sense of purpose that aligned expansion with responsibility. Yet beyond the island, perceptions differed, as some regions welcomed the stability and protection offered, while others viewed the increasing presence of Atlantean forces with suspicion, recognizing that influence, once established, rarely recedes without resistance. Rumors began to circulate among distant lands of a power rising in the West, one that combined wealth, discipline, and ambition. And these stories, whether exaggerated or not, contributed to a growing awareness that the balance of the known world was shifting. Within Atlantis, dissent remained limited, but not absent, as those who remembered earlier generations questioned whether the island's strength lay in its ability to extend outward or in its capacity to remain centered. And though their voices were heard, they were increasingly overshadowed by the momentum of change. The language of duty persisted, framing expansion as necessary, even inevitable. And in this framing, the distinction between protection and control became less clear, allowing actions that might once have been resisted to proceed with little opposition. Thus, Atlantis moved forward, its ships crossing waters that had once seemed distant, its influence spreading along coasts and into cities that now felt its presence. And in doing so, it transformed itself from a model of balance into something more complex, more powerful, and more vulnerable, though that vulnerability remained, for the moment, unseen. The world beyond Atlantis did not remain still while the island extended its reach. And though its expansion had been measured, even careful in its early stages, the accumulation of presence, of ships in distant harbors, of agreements that favored one side more than the other, and of garrisons quietly established along strategic points, began to alter the balance in ways that could no longer be ignored. And slowly, almost reluctantly, other civilizations began to take notice. Along the coasts of the eastern seas, merchants who had once spoken only of profit and weather now spoke of patterns, of fleets that moved not randomly, but with purpose, of ships that traveled in formation and returned along predictable routes. And these observations, repeated across ports and markets, formed a picture of a power that was no longer content to participate in the world, but was beginning to shape it. In the lands of the Nile, where memory was preserved with a precision that few could match, scribes recorded these changes with quiet attention, noting the increased frequency of foreign vessels, the consistency of their organization, and the way their presence influenced trade and movement. And though they did not rush to judgment, they understood that such patterns rarely emerged without intention. Among the city-states of Greece, where debate was as natural as breathing, the reaction was more immediate and more divided, as some saw in Atlantis an opportunity, a force that might bring stability to a region often troubled by rivalry and conflict, while others perceived a threat, recognizing that a power capable of imposing order could just as easily impose control. In assemblies and marketplaces, the name Atlantis began to appear more frequently, sometimes spoken with admiration, sometimes with caution, and sometimes with a mixture of both, as people struggled to reconcile the reports of a civilization that seemed both disciplined and ambitious, balanced yet expanding, a contradiction that made it difficult to predict. Alliances were considered, though not always formalized, as smaller states weighed their options, choosing between cooperation and resistance, often influenced by proximity, by economic need, or by the presence of Atlantean forces already established nearby, creating a patchwork of responses that reflected the complexity of the situation. In some regions, the arrival of Atlantean envoys was welcomed, their proposals accepted, their presence integrated into local systems, bringing a degree of order that was appreciated, especially in areas where instability had previously been common. And for these communities, the island's influence appeared beneficial, even necessary. Elsewhere, however, the same presence was met with suspicion, as leaders questioned the long-term implications of agreements that seemed to favor Atlantis, recognizing that dependence, once established, could limit autonomy, and that the cost of protection might extend beyond what was initially agreed. Reports of minor conflicts began to surface, not yet full-scale confrontations, but skirmishes, disputes over control of harbors, disagreements over terms, and instances where local resistance met Atlantean enforcement, each event small in isolation, but collectively indicative of a growing tension that could not be easily dismissed. Within Atlantis, these developments were interpreted through the lens of responsibility, framed as challenges that needed to be addressed to maintain order, reinforcing the belief that expansion, though complex, was justified, and that resistance, when it occurred, was a natural obstacle rather than a fundamental issue. The councils continued to meet, their discussions increasingly focused on external matters, on how to respond to resistance, how to strengthen alliances, and how to ensure that the network of influence remained stable, reflecting a shift in priorities that placed the wider world alongside, and sometimes above, the concerns of the island itself. Military planning adapted accordingly, with strategies developed not only for defense, but for sustained operations across multiple regions, requiring coordination, supply, and communication on a scale that had not previously been necessary. And while the systems of Atlantis were capable of supporting such efforts, they were now being tested in new and demanding ways. Among those who still remembered the earlier balance, there was a sense, difficult to articulate, that something essential was being stretched, not yet broken, but extended beyond its original purpose. And though they could not point to a single decision as the cause, they recognized that the cumulative effect of many choices had begun to reshape the identity of their civilization. Beyond the island, this transformation became increasingly visible as the presence of Atlantean ships and soldiers altered the daily lives of those who encountered them, creating a reality in which the influence of a distant power was no longer abstract, but immediate, shaping trade, politics, and security in tangible ways. The question that began to emerge, though not always spoken openly, was not whether Atlantis was powerful, for that was evident, but whether that power would remain aligned with the principles that had once defined it, or whether it would continue to evolve into something less restrained, more assertive, and ultimately, more difficult to resist. As this question spread, carried by merchants, envoys, and travelers, it took root in places far from the island, influencing decisions, shaping alliances, and preparing the ground for a response that would test not only the strength of Atlantis, but the very foundation upon which it had been built. And so, while the city itself remained outwardly unchanged, its walls still gleaming, its markets still full, its laws still inscribed upon the pillar, the world around it was beginning to shift, responding to its presence with a mixture of acceptance and resistance, setting the stage for a confrontation that would bring these tensions into the open. War did not begin with a single clash of arms, nor with a declaration shouted across the sea, but with a tightening of circumstance so gradual that many did not recognize its arrival until the first ships moved with purpose rather than trade, and the first orders were given that carried not the language of negotiation, but of command. And in Atlantis, the shift from influence to conflict felt less like a choice than the natural continuation of a path already taken. The councils, still convened beneath the enduring image of Poseidon, now turned their full attention to the realities of confrontation, as reports from distant coasts described resistance that could no longer be managed through agreement alone, and strategies were laid not for persuasion, but for action, marking a decisive moment in the evolution of the island's purpose. Fleets were assembled with a precision that reflected years of preparation, ships moving through the canals and out into open water in ordered formations, their crews disciplined, their equipment ready, and their commanders guided by plans that accounted for tides, currents, and the likely responses of those they would face, transforming the sea itself into a field of maneuver. The first engagements were not grand battles, but controlled operations, attempts to secure key locations, to enforce agreements, to demonstrate strength without inviting full-scale conflict. Yet even in these measured actions, the reality of war became evident as resistance met enforcement, and the balance that had once defined Atlantis gave way to a new dynamic shaped by force. In the regions that had resisted, defenses were organized, not always with the same discipline or resources, but with determination. As communities that had once debated whether to accept Atlantean influence now found themselves united by the necessity of opposing it, creating alliances that might not have formed under different circumstances. Among these, the cities of Greece, particularly Athens, emerged as a focal point of resistance, not because of unmatched strength alone, but because of a tradition of independence and debate that made submission unlikely. And as reports of Atlantean expansion reached its assemblies, the response was not immediate agreement, but careful consideration followed by resolve. Athens prepared with a clarity that reflected its character, calling upon its citizens to contribute according to their ability, organizing its fleet, training its crews, and reinforcing its defenses, not as an empire seeking to expand, but as a city determined to preserve its autonomy. And in this difference of purpose lay a contrast that would shape the conflict to come. The first significant confrontation arose from a blockade, as Atlantean forces sought to control a strategic harbor, believing that by restricting access, they could compel compliance without prolonged engagement. Yet the defenders, familiar with their own waters and unwilling to yield, resisted with a determination that disrupted the expected outcome. What followed was not a single decisive moment, but a series of actions and reactions, as attempts to enforce control met with countermeasures that exploited local knowledge and adaptability, forcing Atlantean commanders to adjust their strategies and revealing that their opponents, though less unified, were not without strength. Naval engagements tested both sides, with Atlantean ships demonstrating their organization and coordination, while their adversaries relied on maneuverability and familiarity with terrain, creating encounters where neither advantage was absolute and where outcomes depended as much on circumstance as on planning. On land, similar patterns emerged, as Atlantean forces, trained for structured engagement, encountered resistance that did not always conform to expectation, requiring flexibility and adaptation. And though they often maintained superiority and discipline, they found that control of territory demanded more than initial victory. The conflict expanded gradually, drawing in more regions, more resources, and more attention as the scale of operations increased, and with it, the strain on systems that had once functioned with ease now required to support sustained effort across distances that tested logistics and coordination. Within Atlantis, the impact of war became more visible as resources were allocated to support campaigns, as attention shifted further outward, and as the sense of certainty that had once defined the island began to encounter the reality of resistance, introducing an element of unpredictability that had long been absent. For those who had questioned the path of expansion, these developments reinforced their concerns, yet by this stage, the momentum of events had made reversal difficult, as commitments had been made, forces deployed, and expectations set, binding the island to a course that could not easily be altered. Beyond the immediate outcomes of individual engagements, the deeper consequence of the conflict lay in its effect on identity, as Atlantis, once defined by balance and restraint, now found itself defined by its actions in war. And in this transformation, the question of what it was began to shift from internal understanding to external perception. The struggle with Athens, in particular, came to symbolize this shift, representing not merely a contest of strength, but a confrontation between differing visions of order, one imposed through expansion, the other defended through autonomy. And as the conflict continued, it became clear that the resolution would carry implications far beyond the outcome of any single battle. Thus, war settled over the world like a storm that had been gathering for years, its arrival neither sudden nor entirely unexpected, but nevertheless transformative, altering not only the fate of those directly involved, but the trajectory of Atlantis itself, as it moved further away from the balance upon which it had once been built. The end of Atlantis did not come as a single moment that could be marked and remembered with clarity, but as a convergence of forces, human and natural, visible and unseen, that had been gathering long before anyone understood where they would lead. And when the final days arrived, they felt less like an abrupt ending and more like the inevitable consequence of a path that had slowly, steadily turned away from its origin. War had already stretched the island beyond its earlier balance, drawing its strength outward, committing its resources to distant struggles, and shaping its identity around dominance rather than restraint. And though victories had been claimed and influence extended, the cost of maintaining such a position had begun to weigh upon the systems that once functioned effortlessly, introducing strain where there had once been ease. Within the city, life continued. The markets still opened, the temple still stood, the laws still existed upon the pillar. Yet beneath this surface, there was a sense, difficult to define but impossible to ignore, that something fundamental had shifted. As though the rhythm that had once guided every aspect of Atlantean life had lost its certainty, replaced by a tension that no structure could fully contain. The rulers, descendants of Poseidon, still gathered, still spoke of order, of control, of maintaining what had been built. Yet their decisions now carried the weight of urgency rather than deliberation, as they responded to pressures both within and beyond the island, attempting to preserve a system that no longer rested upon the same foundation. It was during this time that the earth itself began to change, subtly at first, as tremors passed beneath the ground, slight enough to be dismissed, yet frequent enough to unsettle those who noticed. And though no immediate damage followed, these movements served as a reminder that the stability of the land was not guaranteed, no matter how carefully it had been shaped. The sea, too, seemed altered, its patterns less predictable, its tides shifting in ways that those who had spent their lives upon the water could not fully explain. And while such changes might have been interpreted as natural variations, within the context of an already strained civilization, they took on a deeper significance, suggesting that forces beyond human control were beginning to assert themselves. Warnings appeared in small forms, cracks in stone, unusual flooding along the outer plains, disruptions in the canals that required constant repair. And though each issue could be addressed individually, together they indicated a growing instability, a weakening of the physical structures that had long supported the island's prosperity. Some among the people, particularly the elders and the priests, saw in these signs a reflection of deeper imbalance, interpreting them as consequences of a departure from the principles that had once defined Atlantis. And though such interpretations were not universally accepted, they added to the sense that the island stood at a critical point. Then, without clear warning, the final sequence began, as the ground shook with a force unlike anything before. Not a passing tremor, but a sustained upheaval that fractured stone, collapsed structures, and disrupted the carefully constructed systems upon which the city depended, turning order into confusion in a matter of moments. The rings that had once defined and protected Atlantis became channels of destruction, as water surged through them with uncontrollable force, overwhelming defenses, flooding districts, and carrying debris through streets that had once been models of design, transforming the very structure of the city into a pathway for its undoing. Buildings that had stood for generations fell, their carefully placed stones unable to withstand the movement beneath them, and the temple itself, though strong, could not remain untouched. Its foundations shaken, its surfaces cracked, its presence diminished not through neglect, but through the overwhelming power of the forces unleashed. The people, who had lived with such certainty, now faced a reality that offered no control, as the systems that had guided their lives ceased to function, and survival became immediate, instinctive, stripping away the layers of order that had once defined their existence. Ships in the harbor were tossed against one another or driven inland. Canals overflowed, fields were submerged, and the boundaries that had once separated land and water dissolved, creating a landscape that no longer resembled the island that had been so carefully shaped. As the destruction continued, the distinction between natural disaster and divine judgment blurred in the minds of those who witnessed it. Some seeing in the chaos the hand of the gods withdrawing their favor, others recognizing only the overwhelming power of the earth and sea. Yet regardless of interpretation, the outcome remained the same. In a span of time that would later be described as a single day and night, though it must have felt far longer to those within it, Atlantis, the city of rings, the model of balance, the symbol of harmony, was overcome, its structures broken, its land submerged, and its presence reduced from reality to memory. What remained afterward was not the city itself, but the story, carried across generations, recorded in the words of Plato, and preserved not as a simple account of destruction, but as a reflection on the rise and fall of a civilization that had achieved greatness, and then, through choices both small and large, moved beyond the balance that had sustained it. Whether Atlantis existed as described, whether it was a place lost to the sea, or a lesson shaped into narrative, has remained a question without a definitive answer. Yet its significance endures, not in the certainty of its history, but in the meaning drawn from it. A reminder that even the most advanced societies are not immune to change, and that the forces that shape their rise can also, when misunderstood or misused, contribute to their fall. And so the story lingers, not as a relic of the past, but as a quiet reflection of possibility, of what can be built, what can be lost, and how easily the line between the two can be crossed when balance is forgotten and certainty takes its place.